Hello everybody. In this Python tutorial we're going to begin our basic series on SQLite. This will be part 1. We're going to go over a few notes. We're also going to go over a few things you might want to get set up before we get started. And then we're going to go over the basic steps on how to create a database or database file. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First we'll go over our notes. SQLite provides a lightweight disk-based database that doesn't require a separate server process and allows accessing the database using a non-standard variant of the SQL query language. Some applications can use SQLite for internal data storage. It is also possible to prototype an application using SQLite and then port the code to a larger database. Now for our examples, we're going to be using the Spider Integrated Development Environment, and you can get that through the Anaconda Python distribution. So if you would like to use the Spider IDE, you can Google Anaconda Python distribution, find your operating system, and download the appropriate distribution package. Now if you use Spider and you get that through the Anaconda Python distribution, the module that we're going to be using, the SQLite 3 module, is already included. Okay. Otherwise, if you don't have the SQLite 3 module, you may have to download that through another source or do a pip install or something like that. Another tool you might want is a tool that will allow you to view your .db or database files. Now there are lots of tools that you can use for this. Some web browsers have add-ons or extensions that allow you to work with your database files. If you're on a Mac, you can always search the Mac App Store, and if you're on a PC, you can always just Google for applications that will allow you to view and work with SQLite database files. The specific tool that we're going to be working with is called DB Browser for SQLite, and the database browser for SQLite is an open source tool to create, design, and edit database files compatible with SQLite. Now to get this, and we'll show you how to do this in just a second, you can go to GitHub, search for SQLite Browser, and then find your operating system and follow the instructions for download. Now as always, make sure you're visiting the correct site and make sure that the source and site that you're visiting are safe and secure to download applications. Now another note, the first time you try to open a .db or database file, you may have to associate the application, and specifically the DB browser for SQLite, with the file, or choose Open With Database Browser for SQLite. So now let's go over to GitHub and show you specifically where you can get the DB browser for SQLite. Okay, so here we are at GitHub. Let's go to the search and type in SQLite browser, and the top result is the application. So we're going to click on this. Now you can scroll down. You can see what the application looks like, gives you some information, and then you can find your operating system. So if you're Windows, go here, Mac, go here, Linux, go here. And under each heading for the OS, it gives instructions on how to download the database browser application. Okay? So now let's go back to our Spider IDE. Okay, so now let's go over the basic steps on how to create a .db or a database file. The first step is to import the SQLite 3 module. The second step is to create a database connection, and we're going to go over all the code for this here in just a second. The third step is to create a cursor object. The fourth step is to create a table, and the fifth step is update or edit the data, and this fifth step can actually include a whole bunch of other steps depending on what you want to do to your table or your data, your file, and so on. The sixth step is to save or commit your changes, and then the seventh step is to close the connection when you're finished. Okay, so let's move on to our first step. As we mentioned, the first thing you want to do is import the SQLite 3 module. The second step is to create a database connection, and you also want to give your .db file a name. Okay, so what we did is we created a variable with the name DB, which is short for database connection. Then we assigned our SQLite 3 module, used a dot to access the connect, and inside the round brackets, we put the name of our file, which we've named database1, and we gave it the file name extension .db. Okay, so we've created our connection. Now, another thing to note, when we get to the point where we create our table, you want to make sure that you are familiar with your working directory. So for example, right now, we're just going to be using the desktop. So our file and our table will be saved to our desktop. If you're using Spider, you can see that here. Okay, so moving on to the next step, we're going to create our cursor object. When you create a cursor object and call its execute method, this will allow you to perform SQL commands. And one more note on the cursor. A database cursor is a control structure that enables traversal over the records in your database. Okay, so let's create our cursor object. Okay, moving on to our next step, let's go ahead and create our table. Okay, so what we did is we used our cursor traverse records that we created here. Then we use a dot to access the execute method, and inside the round brackets, we use a set of single triple quotes, and we'll talk more about that in future tutorials. One thing to note though is if you wanted to use regular double quotes, this should work the same, okay? Then inside the quotes, we create our command, which is create table. Then we give the table a name. We've named it stocks1. And then we create our data names and data types. Okay? So our first data element name is date, and the type is text. The second data element name is trans, which is short for transaction, and the type is text. The third name is symbol, type text. The fourth is QTY, which is short for quantity, with the type of real. It's a real number. And the last is price with the type of real. Okay, so let's take a quick look at our desktop. And you can see currently we just have our Python file. You can see .py. Now let's go ahead and try and run this and see if our .db file is created. Okay, now let's go back to our desktop. And you can see our .db database file has been created. Now we're not going to look at this just yet. Let's do a few more things. So let's move on to our next step, and let's insert a row of data. Okay, so again, we use our cursor. We use a dot to access the execute method. Inside the execute round brackets, we put our command, insert into. We're going to insert into the stocks1 table the values here. Okay, so the first value is the date in text form, which we specified here. The next is the transaction in text form, then the symbol in text form, and then the quantity of stocks we're going to buy and the price. Okay, so let's move on to our next step, and let's go ahead and save and commit our changes. To save or commit our changes, we access the database connection, and then we use a dot to access the commit function. Now finally, if you're done with your connection, we can go ahead and close it. To do that, we're going to access the database connection, use a dot to access the close function, and we should be good to go. Now let's go ahead and run this again, and then we're going to go over to our desktop and try and open up the .db database file. And if we've set everything up correctly, we should see our data here in our table. Okay, so here is our database file. Let's open it up. You can see the DB browser for Sqlite application opens up. And just one quick note, remember the first time you try and open up a .db file, you may have to associate the application with the file, or at the very least choose open with the correct application, okay? Okay, so we have our DB browser for Sqlite application open here. Let's go over to our Browse Data tab here. And you can see that we have our data elements in our table. The date, the transaction, which is buy, the symbol for the stock, the quantity we want to buy, and the price. Now, one thing to note, if your data doesn't show up here immediately, one thing you could try to do is close the application, delete the original .db file, and then run your program again. You can also try to hit this refresh button after you have run your code. Now, just to show you that if we close this and we delete this database file, and then we go back to our program and run our code again, it should be back on our desktop. Let's go ahead and open it up again. Go to Browse Data, and you can see that we have all of our table data displayed. Okay, so that's all we have for this part 1 of our SQLite and Python series. Let's go ahead and just recap the basic steps on how to create your .db file. As we mentioned, you want to use an application that has access to the Sqlite 3 module, or you will need to download that module. If you want to view your database information, you can go to GitHub and get the DB browser for SQLite, or you can do a Google search for other applications. To create your database file, you want to import your Sqlite 3 module, create your database connection, then create a cursor, create your table, insert and update and edit your data, save and commit your changes, and then when you're done with the connection, close the connection. Okay, join us for our future SQLite tutorials, and we'll see you next time.